Welcome along to day 3 of SIGA's Sport Integrity Forum, powered by MasterCard. Ben Jacobs with you throughout the day. We've got a great lineup, and remember, if you missed any of our previous panels over the course of the last 2 days, they are on our website and snippets are on social media as well. We had interesting discussions yesterday, including a good interview with Louis Saha on athlete protection, and we also delved into following the money and the world of piracy with a specific focus on BOutQ, the Advanced Pirate Network in Saudi Arabia. Each day has a theme, and today we're focusing on both esports and sports betting, and we'll give you a broad oversight of the latter, but also delve into the world of America, where, of course, gambling in many states is now legalized. We've got experts from all around the world, and we encourage you to get involved as well. Do use the hashtag SIW, and in addition to that, throughout the course of any given panel, you can also submit your questions via the app. One other thing to point out as well is that SIGA is a non-profit organisation, and as a result, we do encourage you, if you have the means. I know that times are difficult at the moment, but if you do wish to make a donation, every single day on social media, you'll see the URL in our handles and posted regularly on Instagram and Twitter, but also a clever little QR code will be popping up periodically on this feed as well. And if you're quick enough and wide awake in the morning to lift up your phone and sync it up, that will take you to the Eventbrite link as well. And we do things a little bit differently here at SIGA as well. So once you're connected and as you donate, you can also partake in a poll, and that actually allows you to dictate where the money goes. We've got lots of different initiatives ranging from a SIGA Youth Council to mentor programs and specific things like conferences such as Sport Integrity Week. And after you've made your donation, you can select which area you want the money to be allocated, and in doing so, help shape our strategy. So once again, a very good morning. It is day 3. We're with you until about 6 o'clock CET, and we're going to get underway now with our opening panel. It is entitled, What is Esports and How Does It Fit into Sport? Esports, of course, is pretty susceptible to corruption, but perhaps unlike most regular sports, more so because it lacks an overarching governing body. To discuss this in further detail, we welcome our moderator, who is 5 Live broadcaster Kyle Walker. Kyle, a very good morning. It is over to you to introduce both the panel and your panelists.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Ben. Yes, welcome to our discussion today. It is entitled, What is Esports and How Does It Fit into Sport? My name is Kyle Walker, and joining me today on the panel, we have Ian Smith from the Esports Integrity Commission. We also have Michelle Varokin, owner of Sporting Integrity, and James Dean, founder and CEO of ESL UK. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Now, I'm really looking forward to this chat because esports is something that I do work in myself as well. So as well as my 5 Live work, I also work with EA, a huge gaming organization, and I work on the esports side of that. And I think we need to kick off this conversation with introducing you guys and why this conversation is important. So I think, Michelle, we will start with you.
Well, I'm probably not the person to start with. My involvement with esports is actually as a consequence of being one of the directors at the Esports Integrity Commission. But certainly it's probably easier that Ian gives the background of that. But I'm involved with traditional sports, and I can see the real challenge for traditional sports now feeling threatened by esports. So, Ian, you kick off and tell us all about esports.
Sure. It looks like I'm frozen on the screen. Can anybody hear me?
It does. We can hear you, Ian. There we go. Are you there? Can you hear us? Okay, it does seem like we're having some issues just with Ian's sound and his picture as well. So we'll try and get those sorted right there. James, I will come to you. And Ian, what I suggest is, could you mute your mic for us, please, just so we're not getting the reverberation from it all, and we can try and sort that all out. But James, I will come to you, founder and CEO of ESL UK. So if you want to give yourself...
Okay, as long as you can hear me, that's good. Nobody needs to speak.
There we go. Hi, good morning. So ESL, if anyone hasn't heard of ESL, is pretty much the largest esports company in the world, and it was founded very early on in this kind of emerging industry, believe it or not, in the year 2000. And over the past kind of 20 years, really, its business model has vastly changed. It started off really about, just simply coordinating gameplay. So people meeting up, bringing their computers together and playing competitive video games. As the internet really started to emerge and become mainstream, that all shifted online. And ESL's model then was to just coordinate tournaments online instead. So it would kind of found and organize tournaments that people could join from home. And ultimately, one of the most important things was obviously trying to consider how people would actually compete in the actual final rounds. And that's when the physicality of esports came back into play. So we started to see the opportunity around actually organizing physical finals events. Now, obviously, in tune to this panel, there's obviously benefits in integrity there, because we have a level playing field to ensure there's no cheating, etc. And ESL was actually, very early in the stage of actually building anti-cheat engines and the likes. Now, come 2012, 2015, we saw a big uprise in something called Twitch, which I'm sure everyone else has heard of as well. And that really did bring the sort of live entertainment aspect to the mainstream. We started to see regular tournaments being broadcast, and obviously that created a huge viewership. At the early stages, ESL was actually contributing about 60% of all of Twitch's content online. And of course, as the stakes are getting higher, prize monies, etc., and obviously the gambling industry started to take an interest in esports too, as an incremental revenue opportunity. We needed to assess how we maintain the integrity of our tournaments ourselves. Now, this was quite an exciting moment in time, because if you imagine with esports, it's extremely digital. Everything that is being played out, the entire computer game, the pitch, if you like, the players behind it, they're all digital. And so the amount of data coming out of this tournament is incredible, and it's very clean and very precise. So of course, this is not only an opportunity for the gambling industry to consider, some amazing in-play betting, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, but of course, at the same time, it's very an interesting place to actually look at the integrity side of things. And ESL is very proud to be one of the founding members of ESIC, which hopefully Ian is back on the line to talk about. But I think what it really does line up is the fact that as this audience is growing, the prize pools are becoming bigger, the tournaments are becoming bigger, the opportunity is certainly becoming bigger for gambling, of course, but also the importance of integrity is absolutely essential too.
It is indeed. Now, as always, with all these things that we've been doing via Zoom in 2020, there's going to be technical issues. But Ian Smith from the Esports Integrity Commission, hopefully this time you are back. Your microphone is working. Your internet connection is all good. And I can leave you to give yourself a bit of an introduction.
Thanks very much, Kyle. I'm so sorry, everyone. The joys of living in the Surrey countryside when the whole world is online. Yes, so to give you some background, I'm a lawyer by training, and I worked in traditional sport for about 20 years, primarily in cricket. So my that part of my career was spent as the legal director of the Professional Cricketers Association here in the UK, in England, primarily working with the 18 first-class counties in the England team. But I then went on to run the Federation of International Cricketers Associations until the Cricket World Cup in Australia in 2015. And as most of you will know, cricket has had its share of difficulties with respect to integrity and in particular match fixing. And so after I left cricket, I was still doing some work in traditional sport, but I was given an amazing opportunity to do an integrity threat assessment of the esports industry. And whilst I had been a gamer literally all my life, and I'm going back to 1976, so before most of you guys were born, playing Pac-Man and Asteroids and in the arcades and wasting my hard-earned pocket money, I did not know anything about esports, and so I had this dramatic introduction over a 3-month period, courtesy of ESL. And their overarching owning company, MTG, who gave me time to look at this industry. And the first thing that struck me from my traditional sport background was the lack of a governing body, which really quite shocked me once I realized the scale of the esports industry and the nature of it. Because with a threat assessment of the nature that I then carried out, what you would normally do is make recommendations to a governing body. If this was football, you'd go to the FA or UEFA or FIFA and say, here are your problems, this is what you need to do. But in esport, there was nowhere to go. And so the suggestion from MTG at the time was, well, can we set something up? And if so, what should it look like? And it was from that strange beginning back in 2015 that ESIC emerged, and we are a voluntary industry regulator on the integrity front. In other words, esports companies, tournament organizers, publishers, publisher-run leagues, and other parties have to voluntarily agree to the integrity standards that we set and enforce, which makes it a somewhat unique model. And amongst the things that we do, we deal with cheating. If we put it broadly, as an organization, we are here to stop cheating. And that's both cheating to win through software hacks, aimbots, wall hacks, DDoS attacks, and the ways in which you cheat in electronic games, doping, and I'll say a bit more of that to intro Michelle's role. And then our primary function, which is cheating to lose, match fixing, betting fraud, because even in 2015, esports had a gigantic underground betting scene based on virtual currency called skins, where people were betting enormous amounts of money. You wouldn't believe the scale. In 2017, we were expecting over $7 billion worth of virtual items to be bet in revenue. As it was, that market was shut down by the publisher of those skins. But you can see the kind of problem there, because it was an unregulated area, and a lot of the people betting were underage. There was no KYC procedures. There was no anti-money laundering. And it was a very dangerous and difficult scene to operate in. So as an industry, we've had significant integrity challenges. But one of the things that I would say that we have done really, really well and better than traditional sport is the development of our anti-doping program, because Michelle's done an amazing job for us as our anti-doping director in setting up a program that actually incorporates and brings along as allies the athletes, which is something that I think that the WADA system has completely failed with. And that would be my introduction to Michelle in terms of, what has she brought to the esports industry on the integrity side with respect to anti-doping, and how she went about doing that.
Now, I think it is so interesting hearing those facts and figures, and actually hearing the work that goes in behind the scenes, and the work that some of the gaming organisations have been doing together to keep up the integrity of the sport. And Michelle, this is where I do want to bring you in, because Ian nicely introduced some of the work that you've done within the anti-doping, and this might be a revelation to some people that there is anti-doping schemes in place when it comes to esports, but as some people may know, and as Ian has just said, that it is a problem that is faced within the industry. So what work have you done before that came about, and then since that you've been working on that?
Well, my background certainly in anti-doping and integrity came from the traditional sports, and we do know that obviously esports could also describe an version of a traditional sport like football, or now we're seeing rowing, cycling, or even horse racing, all going, if you like, online, particularly in this current pandemic. But what really was happening in traditional sports was the imposition of anti-doping rules. And I think what I took up with the opportunity, offered to me through ESL and with ESIC, is to actually engage with the players and say, okay, you think there's cheating going on by doping. What is going on? You tell us exactly what you think needs to be stopped, because we can see you want to play as fairly as you can, because otherwise it just becomes pointless in playing. So, I very much took this from some of the other sports that I've been involved with, and golf's one of those where what's the point of cheating? You're only cheating yourself. And I think the players really engage with that approach. And we've been active now for 5 years, and it's amazing that the players all really came forward, offering their ideas on something that was needed for them to want to say that their sports, whatever they were being protected. So the ESIC anti-doping policy is available for any esports. But it just does take a particular approach, which says, what is it that you're most concerned about? And we saw, some of the players making admissions of the use of particularly stimulant drugs. They weren't bothered by the steroids or the narcotics at that time, certainly, and we've continued by constant surveying of players at the time of testing, and we really are getting an endorsement for the fact that they are concerned about the potential use of stimulant drugs. And the results, I have to say, are in from the jury, and that's not what we're seeing being abused by players, and that is a good endorsement of the fact that the players' concerns are being addressed. So we looked very carefully at the sport, particularly as James has referred to. You've got lots of activity that goes on online, but it's what we call backstage. It's certainly when you get to the major arenas with the big prize money that we've been able to intervene face to face and engage in a way that traditional sports would struggle, because we can test every single competitor every day of that competition if we so choose. And we've tried to align our testing to really focusing in and making it clear that if there is cheating by the use of stimulants going on, we will find it. And the players they are superb. In fact, they are a real participant in their own testing. They want to get that test in after they've competed, in order that they can show that their teams are not engaging in these practices. So what more can I say? It's an absolute revelation. We're not imposing, we're bringing it back up from the players themselves, and we've engaged with management, and so far so good. That's what I say. I'm not saying that there isn't a problem going on, but the way we've tried to address it is to say, look, we can really make sure that we are addressing your concerns. And if you absolutely have a therapeutic need for a stimulant substance for a justifiable medical condition, we do have scrutiny of the medical diagnosis and evidence that backs all that up. So, at the moment, what we've tried to do is keep as vigilant as possible, because, we've got to look out for the next thing. And I really do hope this rolls out to other esports. And we're currently working on a system of being able to do this for backstage at the online competitions as well.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, James, I want to throw it over to you on this, because Your role within ESL, founder and CEO, you must have seen esports as a community and as a sport in itself change and grow in so many different ways over the years. So when it comes to the anti-doping side of it, when it comes to your work with the Esports Integrity Commission, just how far has it actually come?
That's a great question. So to just a bit more context on the structure of ESL, it's a global organization. Our headquarters are actually in Germany, and where it was founded in Cologne. And over the years, we basically built subsidiaries and offices around the world. It's very important because although if you think about a big esport, it attracts a global player base because there's no barriers of entry in that way. You can log in from anywhere. And in fact, if you look at the regionality of esports, it's actually defined, funnily enough, by the latency of the internet. So normally speaking, we would have sort of 3 global regions, obviously the Americas, the European side, and then obviously the Asian area, where they will be provided with servers, if you like, from the game developers to log in and play. Now, so in effect, although we were all working on a national level to build esports, what we were building, initially speaking, was an international playing base. So effectively, we started with the World Cup, and then we started to work on the sort of national championships, if you like. So it's in reverse to traditional sports in a way. So, and as I was mentioning earlier, as the stakes got higher within these different level of tournaments, that's when the inflection point, if you like, occurred to actually consider that we do need to maintain this integrity. So obviously, to start with, we looked at our big global circuits. We have ESL One, Intel Extreme Masters, Pro League, and to just name a few. And we were also operating a white label for some of the big game developers too. So Blizzard at the time, Riot, etc. So effectively, we had to start with those. Doping was absolutely one of them. As Michelle mentioned, these players, they were, and they're getting a bit older now, but they were very young, and they're kind of naive in effect. The sort of stimulants they were taking, such as Adderall, was kind of the normal thing you might take at university just to do better in your exams. So there was a normalization to it to some degree. But of course, when you're playing for $1 million, things change slightly. So that was absolutely crucial. And then as we integrated with and started working with ESIC, obviously we had to look at effectively the data. That was one of the key elements of the integrity. I'm sure Ian will cover a bit more of this in detail. But what we also saw at the same time was a partnership with Sport Radar. And so Sport Radar became effectively the first data partner of ESL. And that was then the introduction of not just the opportunity to analyze data for the integrity side, but also serve the gambling industry too, just making markets and odds, etc. So sort of fast forward a bit further, and as our national leagues started to grow, we actually started to look at that integrity reaching the national championships too. We were starting to see prize monies of £50,000 to £100,000, which we deemed it necessary. Now, I'm not saying that the prize money was necessarily the sort of the variable that we used to decide whether we needed integrity. It was always important, but it's just going to attract the wrong type of attention once that prize money comes about. So yeah, I mean, what we do see in the growth of this is that there are going to be more games coming about, more tournaments, and more sort of spread in terms of size of tournament, national leagues, all the way to these sort of regionals and international tournaments. So we just expect more and more of this, and obviously each game is different. The rules are different. The game publisher has a different approach to esports. The ecosystem, if you like, moves in different waves, and it also needs a different approach when it comes to integrity too.
Now, it is so interesting hearing it from the different perspectives of all three of you, really. And as the theme of this discussion is what is esports and how does it fit into sport? Ian, I want to bring you in on this because you said something really interesting, that you feel that esports does something different and maybe even better that sport does. So when we're keeping in line with the theme of this discussion, when it comes to esports and traditional sport, the two, how are they moving forward together?
Kyle, it's been a very, very interesting development for me to watch. Coming from that strong traditional sports background, obviously being older and more embedded in what I considered to be sport, coming into esport, where back in 2015 there was still a lot of skepticism, and that question kept being asked: is it sport? Is it sport? Is it sport? And the more you realize, being embedded in the industry, that really that was a really stupid question. It was an irrelevance. I know that for some people it does have some degree of relevance still, but that tends to be a very old school attitude, because the fact is that whether or not you call it a sport, whether it is a sport, as an activity, as an industry, it behaves in many, many ways like sport, and certainly when it comes to integrity and betting integrity. But my observation on this is that, in particular over the COVID period, we've seen a drawing together of what were considered the traditional esports, our big, I think anybody within esports would say that there is a big three in terms of the games, which would be Counter-Strike Global Offensive, League of Legends, and Dota 2. Now, for anybody who's listening to us who is not into esports, the three names I've just given there will just, that mean absolutely nothing to them. And the reason for that is that those are pure video games. What was always around, but very much from an esports perspective on the fringe, were what I call the sports simulator games. So FIFA being the most obvious and biggest, published by EA, and then the rival being Pro Evo Soccer from Konami, and then the racing games, Formula One. There's now Formula E, NASCAR, and then, as Michelle mentioned, the E version of traditional sports like yachting, rowing, archery, tennis, and all of those existed. But for those of us in the core of the industry, those were very much peripheral. And certainly from an integrity point of view, particularly gambling, they didn't move the needle. The big three accounts for close to 90% of all betting on esports. In other words, every other game put together, every other esports title makes up less or around 10% of the whole betting market. And none of them barely scratch 1%. And what's changed dramatically during COVID is, as traditional sport disappeared, esports, firstly from the point of view of content, just suddenly jumped into prominence. And similarly, what followed from that was gambling, because suddenly there was no football to gamble on, there was no tennis, there was no nothing. And so your hardcore gambler who was starved of something to bet on moved into what I would call our world. And where they moved, of course, was what they were familiar with, which was not Counter-Strike, League of Legends, or Dota 2. It was FIFA, Pro Evo. It was Formula One. It was Formula E. It was NASCAR, because these were things that people understood as sports, and therefore could easily relate to as content, both in terms of watching and betting. So I've seen this kind of draw together, but the note of caution that I would, there's two things I'd say, is firstly that the governing bodies of those sports did not take the integrity side of those operations at all seriously. I don't think they even considered gambling when they developed those products in haste. And the second thing is that, of course, since the real thing has returned, we've seen a gigantic drop-off in interest in those sports simulator side, quite understandably. And my view on that is that if the esports industry is capable of retaining at least 10% of those new fans, they'll have done very, very well. And so the pandemic period, as tragic as it's been, has been a real boon for esports across the board, because we've acquired a lot of new fans in the traditional esports, and a lot of the sports simulator areas of esports have grown, dramatically, or even with a tail off, there's been a significant improvement.
So then, Ian, how does that affect you and your role, and how does that make it more difficult, I'd say, with a massive influx of people being involved within esports, with a massive influx of competitors, I'm guessing, as well, because more and more people were getting involved in the competitive side because they had more time to do so. And there's a massive influx, as you said, in viewers and people maybe gambling within esports as well. So how did that make your job more difficult in 2020?
In two ways, really. Firstly, there was a massive increase in volume, and where there's more betting, there's more attempts at betting corruption. So suddenly we had more tournaments just generally to deal with, and more betting. But that stayed within our traditional wheelhouse of dealing with Counter-Strike, Dota 2, a little bit of League of Legends. The big difference came with suddenly, through our whistleblower and reporting line, and just directly through messages to me, the number of allegations from disgruntled public or punters in particular around the sports simulator games just rocketed. So usually I get 3 or 4 complaints a week from disgruntled punters telling me that some Counter-Strike match or Dota match or League of Legends match was fixed. And in 99.9% of cases, they are wrong, but nothing quite like a disgruntled punter who's lost a bet. But that suddenly went to 20, 30 complaints, because what you had was football bettors complaining about FIFA matches online being fixed. And I have to say, they weren't right about any of them, but my workload went through the roof on that garbage. But worse was the number of players coming to me with complaints of being approached, threatened, and otherwise abused by attempted match fixers, punters, trying to get them to behave in a certain way. And that was an escalation very, very different to the normal world. I think that was... none of these, I think, turned out to be particularly serious, but they were a massive escalation relative to what we see in normal, what I call normal or traditional esport titles. And this was particularly bad in FIFA, where suddenly I think a bunch of normal football bettors moved into the FIFA world and tried their nonsense there. I had players being offered £30,000 to throw matches in FIFA competitions where the prize money was 10,000. It's like, well, what's going on here? It was a strange period, but it has that I'm pleased to say has tailed off. I would have been a lot happier if the governing bodies that backed up these electronic sport competitions had taken integrity far more seriously from the start. They were so desperate to get a product up, but I think that their normal thought processes were so rushed that it never occurred to many of them that, firstly, that there would be betting and that had consequences for their product.
Now, James, I just want to ask you a question in regards to the different organisations that are all involved in the gaming titles. So we've mentioned a couple of them there, but there are hundreds of games, thousands of games out there. And when it comes to esports, we do have the top games, as Ian mentioned, but there are others that are involved within esports as well. So from ESL UK's point of view, how difficult actually is it to get all of these organisations onto the same page and to actually understand why integrity within esports is important?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because obviously, a game developer is interested in esports probably because they're interested in maintaining a user base, so a player base, and creating an incremental revenue from the content it generates. So call it a marketing exercise for many game developers. A lot of esports are actually free to play, so the user base or the player base actually gets very large very quickly. What tends to happen is that it's not until something more untoward happens that suddenly they go, oh, maybe we should consider some integrity. I mean, even ESL at the moment is I believe the only tournament operator globally who has such a high level of integrity work behind it. We're certainly the first. What we try to encourage is that game developers do consider this. At the end of the day, it's their IP, it's their rules, it's their game. And as a tournament operator, we have a responsibility of the players in our tournament, but also to our sponsors as well. They want to see a return of investment. We've all seen what happens when the integrity gets lost, and how that effectively harms the entire entertainment. It kind of comes to a point of pointlessness. So it's a matter of encouragement, really. We can't force any of the IP owners, the game developers, to adopt these sort of integrity organizations. But what we can do is say, hey, if you opt to work with ESL, and you would like us to look after your esports interests, if you like, we'd like to grow it with you, then by default, we're going to assess the requirement for those integrities. Now, I'd also like to just touch on the actual playing side of things. ESL's core product now really is our tournament platform online, and a lot of people that we employ are in effect virtual referees. We do have a level of analysis on the data coming out of the servers, so we can look for anomalies in that, and try and identify something that shouldn't normally be happening. As Ian mentions, there's a lot of these tournaments happening around the world, and it's only going up. But what we have to do is rely on the players sometimes to identify that there's been some level of cheating, and it's then ESL's responsibility to have referees actually check the games by logging into the servers or looking at some recordings of that game, and actually look to see if there's been any manipulation, or at the end of the day, these games are basically code. So that becomes an important level of our service. Now, there's also another aspect to cheating, is that obviously these games are very complicated, and the balance of the game is extremely important. So we talk about sometimes, you go, oh, you've got that character and he's way overpowered, and it's going to come in and destroy everyone else and ruin the game for everyone. But what happens time to time is that there's effectively a bug in the game, and that bug can be exploited. And it can be as simple as being able to jump on top of a box and you get a different perspective and you can see through a wall slightly, which obviously isn't in the nature of the game itself. And we have to set a rule then to say, well, if we have evidence that a team has taken advantage of this known bug in the game, then we have to declare that as cheating. And obviously, that level of service that ESL is offering from a tournament perspective is super important, because you can't expect a game developer to be monitoring all of these competitive games that are happening all over the world, with all these sorts of stakeholders behind it, and layers and layers of integrity and untoward potential behavior. So I guess at the end of the day, it's just a matter of educating them, and just talking about it. And obviously, we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to the wider industry, such as today on this panel, to share the fact that it is a very serious issue, and it's something that we should all be very aware of, and we should all be considering. So at the end of the day, every game developer should absolutely consider the importance of this integrity, especially if they're planning some level of competitive tournaments.
Thank you, James. Now, Michelle, I wanted to talk to you about the latter part of the theme of this discussion, which is how does it fit into sport when we are talking about esports? And some of the conversations we've already had around gambling, around anti-doping, seem to fit and be in line with the traditional values, I'd say, of sport. So from your perspective, do you see esports fitting into traditional sports, and moving forward, maybe in the future, we will see how the two will start to pair up more and more?
Well, I would say it's probably not worth esports going backwards in life, because esports exists beyond traditional sports. And what is absolutely clear from everything that Ian and James has said is, the value that people see in making sure they're playing a game where it's a matter of skill, and they don't want to see people cheating. Whereas traditional sports, regrettably, has already gone into a culture of, poor governance, poor integrity practice. And we would want to see esports really distance itself from some of the corruption of traditional sports, because it really is, it's what spoilt sports so far. And why would you want an industry to be really, as I say, moving backwards? So the important difference is that we have given a voice to the players, to the industry, to be able to really make it clear this is not acceptable. So the fact that Ian talks about the way that whistleblowing went up through the initial stages of the pandemic, when people did turn to looking at e-versions or e-simulated sports, does say a lot about what needs to happen, because traditional sport has only very recently brought about whistleblowing lines. So we already have monitoring going on of abuse, online abuse, in order to be able to step in and make it clear that we can cut people off in that way. Whereas traditional sports are catching up on those situations. We've only just recently seen, I think it's tennis, introduce some level of protection for players receiving online abuse. So, it's important to see this as not a matter of esports fitting into traditional sports, but it's a big world, and esports exists. It doesn't need to become part of traditional sport. In actual fact, it's been able to show the way in many areas for traditional sports to say, perhaps if we engage more with our athletes, I mean, that's the big cry at the moment, giving the voice to the athlete. Perhaps if we looked at how the industry needs to behave in order to prevent the corruption that has been going on. And that really does mean certainly the way that you do, if you like, embrace, even with, very sort of sensitive areas like, the betting industry. How do you embrace your involvement with them in a way that, esports has pushed on through, because it is a very it is a very dynamic industry. And I think that's where, if you try to impose the hierarchy of traditional sport on the esports industry, you would be taking us backwards. So, I love my traditional sports, but I find working in esports really exciting because it is about, you don't put boundaries there unless there are very good reasons, and you have to make sure that you're taking the industry with you. But everybody is committed to wanting to see, quality esports.
So, Ian, does that make your job easier or harder then? When we're looking at traditional sport, let's say, and then we're looking at the way that esports is changing, it's evolving, it's dynamic, as Michelle put just there, which I think is completely true. Does that make your job easier because we've seen the mistakes maybe that traditional sport has made in the past, and that means that moving forward, when it comes to esports, you know what hasn't worked, and you can maybe put something else in place which might help esports?
Yeah, that's very much the case, Kyle. I was in traditional sport for many, many years, and I still have, more than one toe in that world until the pandemic struck and affected things. I was head of integrity for the PGA European Tour Golf as well, and I advise elements of football still. So I do see, there are some good practices that were brought in. But the biggest difference, and why my job is easier in many ways, is firstly, we're dealing with a digital product. And so proof, as James mentioned earlier, we have a very precise and detailed digital record of absolutely everything that occurred. And so from a data analysis point of view, that's a lot easier than, say, looking at video footage and trying to determine whether, say, a cricketer bowled a ball, no ball on purpose or not, or by accident, or that a golfer missed a putt on purpose or by accident. We've got a very, very precise digital record, not only of what happened in that incident, but how that player or that team reacted to the same incident in the previous 2,000 matches. So we know how they, how they behave. So that makes it easier. And another thing that makes it a considerably easier environment to work in is, and this may sound harsher to people in the traditional sports world, is that because the publishers own the game developer owns the game, they exercise 100% control over it. And what that means is, because nobody owns traditional sport, if you and I can go and play football and FIFA can do nothing about it, right? We can go and play football, we can play cricket, we can play whatever we like. No governing body can come along and say, you cannot play that sport. In esport, the publisher can shut you off at a second's notice. He can say, you can't play this sport. And so what we see, and I have reservations about this, but it is helpful, is that when you're banned from an esport, you're properly banned. You can't play it because the publisher has shut you off. And so our sanctions are far more meaningful in terms of how enforceable these things are, because they are private companies by and large. And let's say EA doesn't want you to play FIFA and you've breached the terms of service in your acquisition of the software that allows you to play FIFA, EA can turn the switch off and you can't do a damn thing about that. And so enforceability is so much easier in esport, which does make my life easier. So it's digital, it's very, I'm sorry, have I dropped off? Something's happened there, the screen. It's an easier environment, but the biggest difference by a million miles from my perspective is the speed with which decisions are made and implemented in esports is amazing. And I always say the analogy for me is when I work in traditional sport, it's like wading through molasses. Everything takes years and years and years of debate and argument and accountability. And there's always 10 guys going, why are you doing this? Why aren't I involved? We've always done it this way. We can't do it that way. In esports, you come up with best practice. You go to a few people and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. And 90% of the time they're, yeah, let's do it. It's really quick. The entire ESIC program was developed in 5 months. When I worked in cricket, the first time we changed the player standard contract, the process took 3 years. And that's the difference. Esports is dynamic, young, adaptable, and quick. Traditional sport moves like lava.
I think that's a great way for people to actually understand it, and just maybe why it's moved so quick, James, esports over the past few years, and how we're actually seeing the integrity of it, the level raise and raise. I will just jump in and just say that for the last 10 minutes, we will be opening it up to questions from the audience. All right, so we'll be getting those in. But just before we get into that, James, I do want to speak to you about that, and actually, it is very exciting, and I feel like we can maybe get weighed down in some of the negatives that we are talking about when it comes to integrity. But I think it's very exciting for esports that this is all happening, and there are organisations like ESL UK, there is the Esports Integrity Commission as well, and the future of integrity within esports is very promising.
Yeah, I think, and Michelle summed it up wonderfully earlier. Esports is its own thing, really, and it's a very large and growing competitive entertainment. Ultimately, we're only going to see that growth. We're still scratching the surface. We might be talking about 500 million people watching on an annual basis at the moment across all the different games, but that's only going to increase. It's going to increase because there's more games coming to market. It's going to increase because of the different platforms getting more serious, things like mobile tournaments, devices like the Nintendo Switch, new consoles, and obviously the continuing growth of PC gaming as well. At the end of the day, what we know is that pretty much the majority of certainly populations such as the UK are playing games. You're a minority if you do not play games. So the natural effect of that is that the viewership is going to increase, the number of competitions will increase, the number of e-athletes, if you like, are going to increase, and the number of games coming into market. And, we see over time some big milestones being hit in terms of viewerships and large number of people playing different games, and you think, wow, nothing's ever going to touch this again. You get Overwatch come about, or and then PUBG, and everyone's thinking, wow, we've not seen 1 million concurrent viewers before, but then suddenly Fortnite comes along, and we will see this time and time again when these massive big IPs just take this global storm, and we start seeing cross-platform play and lots of different ways in which we can amass this huge viewership and huge player base, huge prize monies, huge events. And just to touch on what Ian was saying there, is that what's really important is to remember that these IPs, they're privately owned in many, many cases. They're a private company competing for those eyeballs and those player bases. So in a way, it's empowered the actual community that are playing these games. So, ultimately, the last person, you become a lifelong football fan. You're not going to suddenly get bored of football and say, oh, I'm fed up with that, I'm going to watch rugby instead. That's quite unlikely. Whereas with esports, you might actually say, you know what, that I don't believe in the direction that game developer is taking that IP. I'm going to go and play another game. Why not? I play lots of games and I'm interested in lots of games. So that makes that dynamic super, super interesting, because it will just constantly push the boundaries, push competition, push innovation, push every single aspect of the industry. And as I say, we're just scratching the surface. As it gets more professional, and more and more people are playing and watching, it's only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where the similar question used to be asked, should esports be in the Olympics? Well, not really. Esports is the Olympics of gaming, and it's just brilliant and exciting space to work in. And I just wanted to touch on the fact that a lot of people obviously are very aware that gaming is quite a passive sport in terms of physicality. There's not much movement involved, right? And fundamentally, sport is about the physicality of performance. I think that's something that's going to change too over time. I think, in effect, traditional sports or physical sports will be gamified to some degree. We're going to see very interesting formats where actually these people competing are running around and having to move and jump and dodge things in a very physical space. And we're going to layer on all of this wonderful digital atmosphere and entertainment and everything else that goes with it. And I think I said this to Radio 4 about 4 years ago, that we're going to start seeing this happen. And lo and behold, if you look at the VR side of things and the esports within VR, it's super exciting. You're absolutely relying on people rolling around, ducking out the way, physical actions. And I think that will only, as the innovation improves, that will only become more and more.
Definitely, I completely agree, and I think it is very, very exciting. One thing you did say there, James, which actually, and it genuinely did strike me during this conversation, was esports is the Olympics, and all the different titles, all the different game developers are the different sports as well. And I think that when you think of it like that, then actually it does bring so many people together. And that leads on to my next question. And Ian, this is for you. How important is it that the esports community, the competitors, the people that are watching, so the audience, the developers, all work together to ensure that the integrity of esports is kept to a very high standard?
Carl, it's absolutely essential for the future of the product, because if people lose faith in the product, you lose the industry, right? Is that if people don't believe that what they're watching is a genuine competition between two people or two teams doing their very best to win, then what are you watching? And we have to realize that as an industry, there's both other games to watch and participate in, but there's also other entertainment activities. And at the moment, what esports cannot do is become complacent about these issues, because we've seen certain traditional sports become complacent about their relationship with their fans. And the minute you do that, you alienate those fans. And the roll-on impact is, as James said, is that people have a choice within esport about which game they play and watch and be a fan of, and they can do multiple of those, but they also have choice around other forms of entertainment: music, film, traditional sport, other activities. And so esports needs to keep on its toes, but it also needs to recognize that there are certain standards that need to be agreed and achieved and maintained for the good of the whole industry. And integrity is absolutely at the heart of that, because if you lose it in one part of the industry, you lose it in all parts of the industry, because it affects people's view of what esports is. So a scandal in track and field, for example, affects the Olympics, right? A scandal in swimming affects the Olympics. A scandal in wrestling affects the Olympics. And so the same thing as a scandal in CSGO or a scandal in Overwatch or a scandal in Super Smash Bros. Affects esports. And that's why the industry needs to work together better than it's currently doing. And so I see ESIC as kind of the center of that, in as much as integrity is a very obvious common issue to deal with. I think that the individual games should, of course, be able to govern their esports in terms of rules, regulations, community engagement, commerciality, exactly as they choose, right? I've got no problem with that, but I think that issues like youth protection, live event safety, and integrity are common issues that apply whether you're 50 people playing Super Smash Bros. in a bar in Birmingham, or you're 40,000 people in the Spodek Arena in the middle of Intel Extreme Masters Katowice watching the best Counter-Strike in the world. You've got the same problems. Integrity, the protection of the fans, particularly the young fans, and the safety of the event. Everything else is a free-for-all, and it should be. This is a commercial activity. Let's push innovation, but let's guard the core of the industry, because that's common. So yeah, we need to work together more, but that is happening. Things are moving in that direction, because everybody recognizes that that's what's best for the industry.
Definitely. Now, Ian, thank you so much for that response. And thank you to all three of you for getting involved in this conversation. It's been incredible. So, Michelle, James and Ian, I've had a great hour chatting to you about what is esports and how does it fit into sport. There's been lots of different insight from you all. And I just, again, want to reiterate that. Thank you so much. I hope everyone watching enjoyed that session, and make sure you enjoy the SIGA Sport Integrity Week. There's lots of different discussions that will be happening throughout the week, so make sure you tune in, make sure you enjoy them, and hopefully we'll see you very, very soon. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.